Jake Martinez had never felt so small in his entire life. The testing chamber stretched out before him like a massive cathedral, its walls made of some kind of glowing metal that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Hundreds of alien beings filled the space, each one more incredible than the last. Some floated in mid-air without any visible support. Others phased in and out of reality like ghosts. A few manipulated balls of pure energy between their hands, tossing them back and forth like children playing catch. And then there was Jake. Standing perfectly still. Perfectly normal. Perfectly human. "Candidate Martinez, please demonstrate your telepathic capabilities," a voice announced from somewhere above. The examiner was a being made entirely of crystal, its body refracting light into 1,000 rainbow patterns across the floor. Its voice sounded like wind chimes in a storm. Jake closed his eyes and concentrated as hard as he could. He thought about projecting his thoughts outward, just like they'd taught him in the brief preparation session. He imagined his mind reaching out across the room, touching the consciousness of the examiners. He pushed and strained until sweat beaded on his forehead. Nothing happened. The crystal examiner made a sound like breaking glass. Jake was pretty sure it was a psi. Telepathy score, 2 out of 100. Preliminary assessment, minimal cognitive broadcasting ability. 2 out of 100. Jake's stomach twisted. The passing score was 70. Next evaluation, the voice continued. Physical strength assessment. A massive block of dark metal materialized in front of Jake. Around the room, other candidates were lifting similar blocks with ease. Some used only one hand. Others weren't even touching them, moving the massive weights with their minds alone. One alien that looked like a collection of floating tentacles was juggling 3 blocks at once while carrying on a conversation. Jake approached his block, gripped the handles on either side, and pulled with everything he had. His face turned red. His arms shook. The veins in his neck stood out like cords. The block shifted slightly, rising maybe an inch off the ground before Jake's grip failed and it crashed back down with a thunderous boom. Strength rating, below galactic average. Physical power insufficient for field operations. The words felt like punches. Jake caught his breath and tried to ignore the stares from the other candidates. Some looked confused. Others seemed amused. A few were clearly trying not to laugh. The tests continued for hours. Energy manipulation came next. While beings around him conjured lightning from their fingertips and bent light into solid shapes, Jake managed to produce a tiny spark that fizzled out almost immediately. The examiner didn't even bother announcing a score for that one. There was a test for cellular regeneration. Jake watched as other candidates healed cuts on their arms in seconds. When they made a small incision on his forearm, it bled normally and would clearly take days to heal like any ordinary wound. The speed trials were equally humiliating. The agility assessments were worse. Every single test revealed the same truth over and over again. Jake Martinez was unremarkable. Average. Human. By the time the final evaluation ended, Jake just wanted to disappear. He stood in the center of the chamber while the 3 head examiners conferred in the observation room above. Through the transparent walls, he could see them clearly. They weren't even trying to hide their conversation. "Another disappointing human," one of them said, its voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics. "Why does Earth keep sending candidates? Their species barely qualifies as spacefaring." "It's political," another responded. "The Council wants to appear inclusive. But look at these numbers. Telepathy in the 2nd percentile. Strength below average across all metrics. This one can't even generate a sustained energy field." The 3rd examiner, the crystalline being who'd conducted most of Jake's tests, chimed in with something that might have been laughter. "At least he tried. That's more than some species manage." But really, what were they thinking? Humans are barely past chemical rockets. They still use physical currency on parts of their planet. Jake's hands balled into fists at his sides. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth hurt. But he said nothing. What could he say? Everything they were saying was true. He had failed. Completely and totally failed. The observation room door opened and an ancient being floated out. This was the Academy director himself, someone so old and powerful that most species considered him almost godlike. His form was hard to look at directly, shifting between states of matter like he couldn't quite decide whether to be solid, liquid, or pure energy. "Jake Martinez of Earth," the director's voice rumbled through the chamber. "The Galactic Academy of Advanced Species has reviewed your performance. Your scores place you at 127th out of 130 tested species. 127th. Jake felt the number like a weight settling onto his shoulders. Only 2 species in recorded history have scored lower, the director continued. The aquatic mern, who could not breathe our atmosphere and therefore failed to complete any tests, and the extinct poltheen, who were eliminated by natural selection before achieving space travel. Someone in the observation room was definitely laughing now. Jake could hear it echoing through the chamber. Humanity's petition for Concordat membership is hereby denied, the director announced formally. However, per our traditions, you are welcome to visit the Museum of Impossibilities before your departure transport arrives. Perhaps you will find it educational. The director turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, human, you showed determination. That counts for something, even if it doesn't change the results. Jake stood alone in the empty chamber for a long moment. Around him, the lights began to dim as the facility prepared for the next round of testing with candidates from more promising species. His reflection stared back at him from the polished walls, a single human in a universe that had just told him he wasn't good enough. But then something shifted in his expression. His jaw unclenched. His fists loosened. Yes, he'd failed every test. But he was still standing. And there was still a museum to visit. Jake Martinez walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the empty chamber, having no idea that everything was about to change. The Museum of Impossibilities was nothing like Jake expected. He'd imagined a dusty collection of old artifacts gathering cobwebs in forgotten corners. Instead, he found himself walking through what looked like a palace carved from starlight itself. The ceilings stretched up so high they seemed to touch infinity. Each corridor was wider than a football field, lined with display cases that hummed with their own internal power. His guide was an alien who'd introduced himself as Reed. The creature had 6 limbs, 4 eyes, and an attitude that made Jake's jaw clench every few minutes. Reed moved with a casual arrogance that said he'd rather be literally anywhere else than babysitting a failed human candidate. This way, Reed chirped, not bothering to look back at Jake. We'll make this quick. I'm sure you're eager to get back to your primitive little planet. Jake bit back a response and followed. His legs ached from the long day of testing, but his curiosity was stronger than his exhaustion. Despite Reed's dismissive tone, the museum itself was breathtaking. They passed the first exhibit, a massive set of chains that gleamed like polished obsidian. The plaque read, "The Unbreakable Chains of Kalmar." Jake stopped to read the description. The chains had been forged by an ancient civilization to imprison their gods. For 10,000 years, no being in the universe could break them. Then a species called the Orith had come along and shattered them with their bare hands. "Keep moving," Reed called back. "We don't have all day." The next exhibit showed a wall covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change as Jake looked at them. "The unsolvable cipher of the precursors," the plaque announced. A riddle that had stumped the greatest minds across 50 galaxies for millennia. Until a species called the Vexhari had cracked it in an afternoon. Jake began to notice a pattern. Every exhibit told the same kind of story. An impossible challenge. Countless failed attempts by powerful, advanced species. Then one unexpected species would succeed where all others had failed. What's the point of all this? Jake asked, jogging to catch up with Reed. The alien's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. The museum serves as a reminder that cosmic order isn't absolute. Even inferior species occasionally stumble into achievement. Reed's tone made it clear he considered such occasions flukes rather than genuine accomplishments. "Though I notice your species isn't represented in any of these displays. Perhaps in another few million years of evolution." Jake decided he really didn't like Reed. They walked past dozens more exhibits. The unconquerable maze of Parallax Station. The impossible equation of Throm. The bridge that cannot be crossed. Each one had been defeated, solved, or conquered by some species that everyone had underestimated. Then they entered the central chamber, and Jake forgot how to breathe. The room was circular, easily 100 feet across. The floor was made of something that looked like polished midnight, reflecting everything above it perfectly. And in the exact center, on a pedestal that seemed to be carved from compressed starlight, stood a sword. It wasn't large. Maybe 3 feet of blade, with a handle that looked sized for human hands. But everything about it screamed impossible. The metal, if it even was metal, seemed to shift between solid matter and pure light. Shadows and starfire played along its edge in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Just standing near it made Jake's skin prickle with energy. "The Blade of Burden," Reed announced, his voice finally showing something other than boredom. It sounded like reverence mixed with fear. "The crown jewel of our museum. The one artifact that remains unconquered." Jake moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. The plaque at the base of the pedestal was longer than the others, carved in hundreds of different languages. The English translation read, "Recovered from the dead world of Theraxis approximately 47,000 years ago. Origin and purpose unknown. The blade has remained immovable since its discovery. Over 10,000 individuals from 312 different species have attempted to lift it. All have failed. Quantum analysis indicates the sword exists in a state of infinite mass. Theoretical physicists believe it may be locked to a specific point in spacetime, though this theory remains unproven." "Infinite mass," Jake whispered. "That's not possible." "Obviously it's not actually infinite," Reed said with the tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. "The station would collapse into a black hole. But the mass fluctuates between zero and numbers our instruments can't measure. One moment it weighs nothing. The next moment it weighs more than a planet. And it changes states too quickly for anyone to exploit the zero-mass moments." Jake circled the pedestal slowly. The sword seemed to track his movement, though he knew that was impossible. It was just a trick of the light playing off its strange surface. "The KRYNN hold every strength record in galactic history," Reed continued. "Their greatest champion spent 3 days trying to move this blade. It didn't shift even 1 millimeter. The Vex Harry tried using their mental powers to manipulate it. Nothing. The Orith, who broke the unbreakable chains, couldn't budge it. Species that can move moons with their minds, beings that exist partially outside normal physics, warriors who've conquered entire star systems. All failed. Has anyone from Earth tried?" Jake asked. His voice sounded distant to his own ears, like someone else was speaking. Reed pulled out a small device and tapped at it with 2 of his 6 limbs. "Let me check the database." "No. Your species was only discovered 47 cycles ago. You're far too new and far too weak. Besides, you just failed the strength trials worse than 95% of tested species. The strongest humans couldn't even lift the test blocks to passing level." Reed started moving toward the exit on the far side of the chamber. "Come along. There are a few more minor exhibits before we reach the departure terminal. Your transport leaves in 2 hours." But Jake wasn't following. He stood transfixed before the sword, that strange pulling sensation growing stronger. His hands itched. His heart hammered in his chest. Every logical part of his brain screamed that this was stupid. He'd just failed every test they'd given him. This blade had defeated champions from hundreds of species, beings with powers that made humans look like insects by comparison. And yet, "Has anyone from Earth tried?" he repeated, louder this time. Reed turned back, his 4 eyes narrowing. "I just told you no. And I strongly advise against embarrassing yourself further, human. You've had a difficult day. Don't make it worse by providing entertainment for the security footage archives. Failed candidates attempting the burden is always good for a laugh in the break rooms." Something in Jake's chest ignited at those words. The condescension. The casual cruelty. The absolute certainty in Reed's voice that Jake was beneath consideration. Jake stepped onto the platform. Immediately, alarms began to shriek. Red lights flashed along the walls. Reed jumped back with a startled chirp. "What are you doing? Get down from there." But Jake was already reaching for the sword. His fingers wrapped around the handle, and the universe seemed to hold its breath. From somewhere outside the chamber, Jake could hear running footsteps. Shouting voices in a dozen different languages. The alarms grew louder. Reed was frantically speaking into his communication device. "Security to the central chamber. The human is attempting the burden." "Yes, I know, completely foolish, just get here." Jake ignored all of it. His hands tightened on the sword's grip. The metal, if it was metal, felt warm under his palms. Almost alive. He planted his feet, bent his knees, and pulled with every ounce of strength in his body. The sword didn't move. Not even slightly. It was like trying to lift the planet itself. Jake's face went red. His arms trembled. The muscles in his back screamed. He pulled until he saw spots dancing in his vision. Nothing. The blade remained exactly where it was, as immovable as a mountain. Within 3 minutes, the central chamber was packed with spectators. Word had spread through the station like wildfire. A human, the same one who'd just bombed every test in Academy history, was attempting to lift the blade of burden. It was too ridiculous not to watch. Jake was still pulling on the sword, his entire body shaking with effort. Sweat poured down his face and soaked through his shirt. His hands had gone white from gripping the handle so hard. But the blade hadn't moved even a fraction of an inch. "Is he serious right now?" someone in the crowd laughed. The human who couldn't generate a single energy spark thinks he can lift the burden, another voice called out. Jake recognized it as one of the crystalline examiners from his tests. This is absolutely perfect. More aliens poured into the chamber. Students from the academy. Maintenance workers. Scientists. Even some of the high-ranking officials Jake had seen earlier in the observation room. They formed a circle around the platform, watching with expressions that ranged from amusement to outright mockery. Reed stood off to one side, all four of his eyes wide with what looked like second-hand embarrassment. I told him not to, the guide was explaining to anyone who'd listen. I specifically advised against it. But humans are stubborn creatures. Very limited understanding of their own capabilities. Jake heard every word. Each laugh felt like a knife between his ribs. Each mocking comment made his face burn hotter. But he didn't let go. His fingers remained locked around the sword's handle. He pulled and strained until his vision started to blur. Still nothing. The sword might as well have been welded to the pedestal. No, it was worse than that. It felt like trying to move reality itself. Like the blade was the single fixed point in the universe and everything else could shift around it, but it would never, ever budge. Someone start a timer, a voice called from the crowd. Let's see how long before he gives up. I've got 30 seconds, someone else responded. Too generous. I say 15. They were betting on him. Actually placing wagers on how quickly he'd fail. Jake's arms trembled violently now. His back felt like it was tearing in half. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to let go, to stop this humiliation, to walk away before he made an even bigger fool of himself. He pulled harder. The crowd's laughter grew louder. Someone had pulled up a holographic display showing Jake's strength scores from earlier in the day. They floated in the air for everyone to see. Below average. Insufficient. Inadequate. The numbers glowed in harsh red light. Look at those scores and then look at him trying to lift the burden, a voice wheezed with laughter. It's like watching an insect try to move a boulder. At least insects know their limitations, another responded. 30 seconds passed. Then 4 to 5. Jake's legs began to shake. His grip was starting to slip from all the sweat on his palms. The sword remained absolutely, impossibly still. He might as well have been pulling on the station itself. At the 1-minute mark, Jake's strength finally gave out. His hands slipped off the handle and he stumbled backward, nearly falling off the platform. He caught himself at the last second, breathing in huge gasping gulps. His arms hung limp at his sides, completely spent. The crowd erupted in applause and laughter. Not the kind of applause that celebrates achievement, but the mocking kind that punctuates a particularly entertaining failure. Well, that was predictable, the crystalline examiner announced loudly. Shall we all return to our duties? The entertainment is over. The academy director himself was there, the ancient being whose form shifted between states of matter. He shook his head slowly. The human showed spirit, I suppose. But spirit doesn't move mountains. Or in this case, blades. He turned to leave, his voice carrying across the chamber. Someone escort the candidate to his transport. And perhaps add a note to Earth's file about managing expectations more realistically. That got another wave of laughter. The crowd began to disperse, already moving on to more interesting matters. A few aliens lingered to take photos or record videos of Jake standing defeated on the platform. Proof they'd witnessed the amusing spectacle. Something to share with friends over dinner. Reed approached the platform cautiously. Are you finished now? Can we please proceed to the departure terminal before you decide to attempt any other impossible feats? Jake didn't answer. He was staring at the sword, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his chin onto the platform floor. His arms felt like dead weight. His back throbbed with pain. Every part of his body hurt. And yet he couldn't look away from the blade. Human? Jake Martinez? Reed's voice grew more insistent. Your transport leaves in 90 minutes. We really must go. The chamber was nearly empty now. Just Reed, a couple of lingering security guards, and a handful of students still chuckling about what they'd witnessed. The alarms had been silenced. The red lights had stopped flashing. Everything was returning to normal. Jake took a step toward the sword again. Oh, for the love of, Reed threw up 4 of his 6 limbs in exasperation. What are you doing now? You tried. You failed. It's over. Accept it and move on. But Jake wasn't reaching for the sword this time. Instead, he did something that made Reed's 4 eyes blink in rapid confusion. Jake sat down. Right there on the platform. Cross-legged. Directly in front of the blade of burden. Then he closed his eyes. What are you doing? Reed demanded. Jake didn't answer. He just sat there, breathing slowly, his eyes closed, his hands resting on his knees. Is he meditating? One of the remaining students asked. Meditating? Another student laughed. What good will that do? Is he going to achieve enlightenment and suddenly gain super strength? That's not how physics works. Maybe it's a human thing, a security guard suggested. Some kind of ritual they perform after failure. To cope with disappointment. How primitive, Reed muttered. He tapped at his communication device. This is ridiculous. I have other duties. I can't spend my entire cycle waiting for a human to finish his meditation session. But station protocol was clear. Reed was assigned as Jake's guide until the human departed. Which meant he had to stay. With growing frustration, Reed settled against the wall to wait. The remaining spectators eventually lost interest and wandered off. Even the security guards left, confident that a meditating human posed no threat to the museum's most prized artifact. 15 minutes passed. Jake didn't move. His breathing had become slow and steady. His face, which had been scrunched up with effort earlier, now looked peaceful. Calm. Reed fidgeted constantly. He checked the time on his device every 30 seconds. He shifted from foot to foot to foot to foot to foot to foot, his 6 limbs never staying still. After half an hour, he started pacing circles around the chamber. This is absurd, Reed muttered to himself. Completely absurd. The human fails to lift the sword, so he sits in front of it like that will somehow change the outcome. As if the universe cares about determination or persistence. The blade operates on quantum principles, not emotional ones. 45 minutes. 1 hour. Jake remained motionless. His breathing never changed. He looked like a statue himself, as fixed and immovable as the sword before him. Reed's patience was wearing dangerously thin. Human. Your transport leaves in 30 minutes. If you miss it, the next one doesn't depart for 3 cycles. You'll be stuck on this station for days. No response. Jake's eyes stayed closed. His breathing stayed even. Fine. Reed threw his limbs up again. Miss your transport. See if I care. I'll note in my report that you refused to cooperate. But even as Reed complained, something strange was happening that he didn't notice. The sword's light, which normally pulsed in random patterns, had begun to synchronize with Jake's breathing. When Jake breathed in, the light brightened slightly. When he exhaled, it dimmed. The change was subtle, barely perceptible. But it was there. The station's instruments registered nothing. The quantum readings remained unchanged. By every measurable standard, nothing was happening. Jake was just a human sitting in front of an impossible sword, wasting everyone's time. But something was shifting. Not in the physical world, but somewhere deeper. In a place where determination mattered more than strength. Where understanding mattered more than power. Where the willingness to sit with failure and simply be present could open doors that force never could. Jake sat in perfect stillness, and for the first time since he'd entered the museum, he wasn't thinking about failing the tests. He wasn't thinking about the mocking laughter or the disappointed looks. He wasn't thinking about proving anything to anyone. He was just there. Present with the sword. Present with himself. Present with the simple truth that sometimes trying harder wasn't the answer. Sometimes you had to try differently. 2 hours had passed. The transport Jake was supposed to catch had left without him. Reed had finally given up trying to get him to move and had slumped against the wall, dozing off between frustrated glances at his communicator. The museum had entered its night cycle, and the lights had dimmed to a soft glow. The chamber was completely silent except for the gentle hum of the station's life support systems. Jake's eyes were still closed. But his mind had never been more awake. Sitting there in the stillness, something had begun to click into place. All day long, he'd been approaching everything the wrong way. During the tests, he'd tried to be what the examiners wanted. Strong. Powerful. Exceptional. He'd pushed and strained and forced himself to be something he wasn't. And he'd failed spectacularly because of it. Then he'd come to the sword and done the exact same thing. Tried to muscle it off the pedestal through pure determination and effort. Just like every other candidate who'd attempted it over the past 4 to 7,000 years. Thousands of beings, each one stronger than him, each one more powerful, each one certain that they could succeed where others had failed. And every single one had approached it as a test of strength. But what if it wasn't? Jake's eyes opened slowly. The sword stood before him, its light pulsing gently in the dimness. He stared at it with fresh eyes, seeing it clearly for the first time. It's called the Blade of Burden, Jake said softly. Reed jerked awake with a snort. What? Are you finally ready to leave? The Blade of Burden, Jake repeated, his voice still quiet but steady. Not the blade of strength. Not the warrior's edge. Not the champion's sword. Burden. Reed rubbed at his eyes with two of his limbs. So? It's just a name. The civilization that created it is dead. No one knows what they actually called it. That's just what the archaeologists labeled it based on the context they found it in. No. Jake stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting so long. Names matter. Especially for something this important. A burden isn't something you lift with strength. It's something you carry even when you're not strong enough. It's weight you bear not because you can, but because you must. Reed was fully awake now, all four eyes focused on Jake. That's just semantics. The quantum readings don't care about philosophy. The sword has a measurable mass that fluctuates to impossible levels. No amount of clever wordplay changes the physics. You're right, Jake said, taking a step closer to the pedestal. The physics don't change. But maybe I've been trying to fight the physics instead of understanding them. He circled the sword slowly, his hand hovering near it but not touching. Every species that tried to lift this was successful. They were champions. The best their people had to offer. They'd proven themselves worthy in 100 different ways. They came here confident, powerful, certain of their abilities. Obviously, Reed said with a hint of his earlier condescension. Why would you send anyone but your best to attempt something impossible? That's exactly the point. Jake stopped circling and faced the sword directly. You send your best. You're proven. You're worthy. People who've succeeded at everything else. But what if the sword doesn't want success? What if it's testing for something else entirely? Reed made a dismissive sound. Like what? Failure? That makes no sense. Not failure, Jake corrected. Humility. The willingness to carry weight you haven't earned. To bear responsibility you're not qualified for. To stand up knowing you'll probably fail. He reached out and touched the sword's handle gently, not trying to lift it yet. The metal felt warm under his palm, almost alive. I failed every test today. Every single one. I ranked near the bottom of 300 species. I'm weak. I'm slow. I have no special powers. By every measure your civilization uses, I'm insufficient. Yes, we've established that, Reed said uncomfortably. What's your point? My point is that maybe that's exactly what this sword has been waiting for. Jake's grip tightened slightly on the handle. Not someone strong enough to carry it. Someone humble enough to bear it. Someone who knows they're not worthy but is willing to try anyway. The lights in the chamber suddenly flickered. Reed jumped to his feet. What did you just do? Nothing yet, Jake said. But he could feel something. A shift. Like the sword was listening to him. Like it had been asleep for 47,000 years and was finally starting to wake up. Think about it, Jake continued, his voice growing stronger. Every champion who came here approached this as another test to pass. Another challenge to overcome. Another way to prove their superiority. But what if that's the opposite of what the sword wants? Reed was backing away slowly. The quantum readings are fluctuating. I'm seeing energy spikes across multiple spectrums. Human, whatever you're doing, maybe you should stop. Humanity will never match your telepathy, Jake said, ignoring Reed's warning. We'll never have your strength or your energy manipulation. We'll always rank near the bottom of your tests. We'll always be insufficient by your standards. The lights flickered again, stronger this time. The sword's glow was intensifying, pulsing faster. But we're really good at one thing, Jake continued. We're excellent at carrying burdens we shouldn't have to. At solving problems we didn't create. At standing up when standing up is all we can do. We fail constantly. We're weak. We're limited. And we keep going anyway. Human. Reed's voice had gone high with panic. The mass readings are going crazy. The sword is cycling between 0 and infinity faster than the instruments can track. Jake looked at the blade, really looked at it, and he understood. The Thoraxians who'd created it hadn't left a weapon. They'd left a message. A warning and a test wrapped into one. They'd been powerful, successful, advanced. And somehow that had destroyed them. They'd built this blade to find someone who understood what they'd learned too late. That sometimes strength wasn't the answer. That sometimes power led to arrogance. That sometimes the people best equipped to carry the weight of responsibility were the ones who knew they weren't qualified. The sword doesn't want a champion, Jake said quietly. It wants someone who knows what it feels like to fail. Alarms began shrieking throughout the chamber. Emergency lights flashed red along the walls. Reed was frantically speaking into his communicator, calling for help, calling for the director, calling for anyone. Jake closed his eyes one more time. He thought about every test he'd failed that day. Every mocking laugh. Every dismissive comment. Every number that told him he wasn't good enough. He let himself feel the full weight of that inadequacy. He accepted it. Embraced it. Then he pulled. And this time, the universe screamed in response. The sword's mass collapsed to zero in the exact instant Jake applied force. But it wasn't just physics. It was recognition. The blade had found what it was looking for. Not strength. Not power. Not worthiness. Humility. The willingness to bear weight anyway. Jake lifted the blade of burden from its pedestal, and as he raised it above his head, the weapon blazed with light that existed in colors the station had no instruments to measure. The energy washed through the chamber like a wave, not destructive but transformative. It painted patterns on the walls that looked like prophecy and memory mixed together. Reed had fallen to the floor, all 6 limbs sprawled out, all 4 eyes wide with shock. Impossible, he whispered. The quantum lock. The infinite mass. Nothing in physics allows this. Jake held the sword easily, like it weighed nothing. Which, in that moment, it did. The weight wasn't physical. It never had been. Footsteps thundered in the corridor outside. Alarms continued to wail. The entire station knew something impossible had just happened. Jake looked down at Reed. You were wrong about one thing. It's not about physics. It's about understanding what you're really being asked to carry. The chamber doors burst open and the academy director rushed in, followed by dozens of officials and security personnel. They all stopped dead at the sight before them. A human holding the impossible sword, its light reflecting in his eyes, standing where 47,000 years of champions had failed. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session exactly 4 hours after Jake lifted the sword. He stood in the grand chamber, the blade still in his hands because he'd discovered something troubling. Every time he tried to set it down, the moment his fingers left the handle, the sword became completely immovable again. He'd tested it 3 times before giving up. Whatever this thing was, it had chosen him, and apparently it wasn't letting go. The chamber was enormous, circular, with seats rising in tiers that seemed to stretch up forever. Representatives from hundreds of species filled those seats, their voices creating a din of confusion and argument in countless languages. Translation devices struggled to keep up with the overlapping conversations. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. How had a human, the weakest candidate tested in decades, accomplished what thousands of champions could not? Jake stood in the center of it all, exhausted beyond words but unable to rest. The sword wasn't heavy, not physically, but he could feel its weight in other ways. Every eye in the chamber was on him. Every conversation was about him. The pressure of it all made his shoulders ache worse than any physical burden could. The academy director floated at the head of the chamber, his form shifting between solid and energy as he called for order. It took several minutes for the noise to die down enough for him to speak. We are here to address an unprecedented situation, the director's voice boomed through the space. The blade of burden, immovable for 47,000 years, has been lifted by candidate Jake Martinez of Earth. According to all historical precedent and traditional law, whoever lifts the blade inherits the responsibility it represents. But what responsibility? A crystalline representative called out. The Thoraxians left no records. We don't even know what the sword was meant for. The director gestured and holographic displays materialized throughout the chamber. Ancient texts. Archaeological surveys. Quantum analysis reports. Decades of research compiled into a desperate attempt to understand what had just happened. Our best historians have been working through the night, the director explained. The Thoraxians were once our equals. Perhaps our superiors. Their civilization spanned 12 star systems. They had technology we still don't fully understand. And then, in less than a century, they tore themselves apart in civil war. The holograms showed images of dead worlds. Cities reduced to rubble. Entire planets scarred by weapons that had burned atmosphere itself. It was devastation on a scale that made Jake's stomach turn. The blade was forged in their final years, the director continued. We believe it was created by the last surviving faction, just before they too went extinct. Whether it was meant as a weapon, a memorial, or a message, we cannot say with certainty. A reptilian representative stood, her scales shimmering under the chamber lights. Then how can we assign responsibility based on it? For all we know, lifting the sword means nothing at all. Perhaps the quantum lock simply failed after all these millennia. No. Jake's voice cut through the murmur that had started. Every head turned toward him. He hadn't meant to speak, but the sword seemed to pulse in his hands, almost encouraging him. It's not a weapon. And it's not meaningless. The director studied him carefully. Explain yourself, human. Jake took a breath, organizing thoughts that felt almost too big for his head. You preserve failures here. In your museum. The unbreakable chains that were broken. The unsolvable cipher that was solved. You celebrate these things, but you don't really learn from them. We honor the achievements of those who overcame impossible odds, a voice protested from the upper tiers. No, Jake said more firmly. You honor the exceptions. The flukes. The moments when someone got lucky. But you don't change your systems based on them. You just added me to your collection. Another impossible thing that happened. Something to point at and say, isn't that interesting, before going back to business as usual. The chamber erupted in argument. Some representatives shouted agreement. Others called out an offense. The director raised a hand for silence, his eyes fixed on Jake. Continue, he said simply. Jake lifted the sword slightly, its light casting strange shadows across the chamber walls. The Thoraxians made the same mistake you're making. I'd bet anything they had tests too. Standards. Ways to measure who was worthy and who wasn't. They probably built their whole civilization on being the best, the strongest, the most advanced. He looked around at the assembled representatives. And it destroyed them. Because when everyone in your civilization has proven they are superior, when everyone has passed all your tests, when no one remembers what it's like to fail, you forget something crucial. What? The crystalline representative asked, and for the first time, her tone held genuine curiosity rather than condescension. You forget humility, Jake said. You forget that being powerful doesn't make you right. That passing tests doesn't make you wise. That strength doesn't equal understanding. The sword pulsed brighter, as if confirming his words. The blade chose someone who failed because that's the lesson the Thoraxians learned too late. They left this here as a warning. As a test. Not for strength or power or worthiness. A test to see if any civilization would be humble enough to recognize what really matters. Jake's arms were shaking now, not from the sword's weight but from the exhaustion of the past day catching up with him. You rejected humanity. You told us we weren't good enough. That we ranked near the bottom of every measure that matters to you. And you were right. By your standards, we are insufficient. He met the director's eyes directly. But maybe your standards are wrong. Maybe the things you measure aren't the things that matter most. How many species have you rejected over the millennia? How many Jake Martinez's have you sent home for not being good enough? How many civilizations have you dismissed because they didn't fit your hierarchy? The chamber had gone completely silent. Even the translation devices seemed to have stopped humming. The Thoraxians left this sword as a mirror, Jake continued. They wanted someone to find it who would understand. Who would see what they'd become and recognize the danger. They knew that any civilization arrogant enough to think they'd figured everything out was on the path to their own destruction. The reptilian representative spoke softly. You're saying we need to change our entire system. Our standards. Our tests. Everything we've built. I'm saying you need to remember how to fail, Jake replied. You need people who haven't proven themselves. Who don't fit your perfect hierarchies. Who struggle and mess up and keep trying anyway. He looked down at the sword in his hands. Humanity will never match your telepathy. We'll never have your strength or live as long or manipulate energy with our minds. We'll always be at the bottom of your rankings. But we know how to carry burdens we shouldn't have to. How to face problems bigger than ourselves. How to stand up when standing up is all we can do. The director floated down from his position until he was level with Jake. You understand this will change everything. If we accept what you're saying, if we truly embrace this lesson, the entire structure of the Concordat will need to be rebuilt. I know, Jake said. Humanity will be granted membership. Not as a charity case, but as equals. As teachers. You and that sword will serve as constant reminders to every species in the Concordat about what we risk forgetting. Jake felt the weight of those words settle onto his shoulders like physical pressure. He was so tired. His body ached. His mind felt like it was full of static. All he wanted was to go home, sleep for about 3 days, and maybe never think about alien tests again. But the sword pulsed in his hands, warm and steady, and he understood. This was the burden. Not the weapon itself, but what it represented. The responsibility to keep an entire galactic civilization honest. To stand as a living reminder that strength wasn't everything. That failure had value. That the people at the bottom of the hierarchy might have wisdom the people at the top had forgotten. I accept, Jake said quietly. The council voted 3 hours later. The decision was closer than anyone expected, but it passed. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Concordat, with Jake serving as special ambassador. News of the decision reached Earth before Jake did, transmitted faster than light through quantum communication networks he barely understood. When his transport finally landed at the designated coordinates, he stepped out to find thousands of people waiting. News crews from every major network. Government officials. Scientists. Regular people who'd heard the story and wanted to see the man who'd lifted an impossible sword. Jake stood at the edge of the landing platform, the blade of burden across his shoulders, feeling its weight in ways that had nothing to do with physics. He thought about everything that had happened. The tests he'd failed. The laughter and mockery. The moment of understanding before the sword. The responsibility he'd accepted. Someone from the crowd shouted a question. How does it feel to be a hero? Jake looked down at the sword, then back at the crowd. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who was willing to fail and keep trying anyway. The universe didn't need someone strong. It needed someone humble enough to admit they weren't. As the sun set behind him, casting long shadows across the landing platform, Jake understood something profound. The real test had never been about lifting the sword. It had been about understanding why someone needed to. About recognizing that sometimes the greatest strength was admitting you were weak. That sometimes the most important voice in the room belonged to the person everyone had dismissed. The blade of burden had found its bearer. And Jake had found his purpose, not in being sufficient but in showing up anyway, carrying weight he hadn't earned, standing as proof that failure wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning.